In recent years, there has been a growing chorus of dissatisfaction with the United Nations, with multiple countries voicing frustrations about the organization's governance and perceived Western dominance. While no nation has fully withdrawn from the UN, a handful have threatened to do so, raising questions about the organization's future role in global affairs. One of the most notable cases occurred in 1965, when Indonesia declared its intention to leave the UN following a dispute over Malaysia's seat on the UN Security Council. Despite this declaration, the UN did not formally recognize Indonesia's withdrawal, and the country rejoined the organization in 1966 under a new government. More recently, in 2016, then Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte publicly threatened to pull the country out of the UN after the organization criticized his controversial war on drugs. Duterte accused the UN of meddling in internal affairs, but ultimately, the Philippines did not follow through on the threat. In the United States, proposals to leave the UN have periodically emerged, particularly among isolationist political groups. A notable example came in 2017 with the introduction of the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which sought to terminate US membership in the UN. Though the proposal gained some political traction, it has consistently failed to pass, largely due to concerns about the diplomatic fallout and the significance of multilateralism in US foreign policy.
One of the most vocal groups calling for significant reforms within the UN has been the BRICS alliance, comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Along with a growing number of global South nations, BRICS has argued that the current structure of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, disproportionately favors Western powers. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, wield veto power, a mechanism that many developing countries say is outdated and reflective of post-World War II geopolitical realities. Despite representing over 40% of the world's population and nearly a quarter of global GDP, the BRICS bloc remains underrepresented in key international institutions.
The BRICS nations have frequently accused the UN and other global organizations of favoring Western countries, both in decision-making processes and in the enforcement of international standards. Countries like Russia and China, for instance, are often criticized for their domestic policies, including Russia's treatment of LGBTQ+ individuals and China's actions in Xinjiang and Tibet. However, BRICS members argue that similar human rights issues in Western nations, such as racial profiling or the mistreatment of indigenous populations, receive far less international scrutiny. This perception of double standards extends to conflicts as well. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, critics note that while Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians have been widely condemned, international reactions to Israel's retaliatory measures, including the use of white phosphorus and blockades on Gaza, have been comparatively subdued. Human rights groups such as Amnesty International have raised concerns, but these issues have not garnered the same level of global outrage.
BRICS fight for influence. The power struggle between the BRICS bloc and the Western-dominated institutions is not new, but it has intensified as emerging economies grow increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo. While BRICS nations collectively represent nearly 25% of global GDP, their voting power at the IMF remains closer to 15%. China, the world's second-largest economy, holds less than 7% of the voting rights at the IMF, despite an economy that now exceeds $18 trillion. These frustrations are driving BRICS members to push harder for reforms, particularly within the UN Security Council, where they advocate for permanent seats for large developing nations like India and Brazil. But despite gaining some traction, such proposals face significant resistance from Western powers, which are reluctant to relinquish their dominant roles in these global institutions.
The road ahead. The BRICS bloc's calls for reform are not limited to the UN. Members are pushing for broader changes in global governance, arguing that current systems disproportionately benefit the global North while sidelining the interests of the global South. Some have proposed strengthening regional organizations such as the African Union and the Organization of American States as a way to enable more localized governance that better addresses regional issues. As BRICS continues to grow, recent expansions have added countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Their influence on global economic power structures is increasing. If meaningful reforms within established institutions like the UN remain elusive, the BRICS nations could focus on creating alternative frameworks for global governance. This, in turn, could gradually reshape the international order and reduce the relevance of Western-led institutions. Whether or not the BRICS bloc can overcome its internal differences to present a united front remains to be seen, but their drive for a more balanced and equitable global system will likely continue to shape international debates for years to come.
Stay tuned for more updates on global politics and the shifting dynamics of international governance. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for the latest reports and analyses.